My son was born with a mild form of cerebral palsy. He walks with a slight limp, nothing painful, just different. One afternoon, I overheard our neighbor Sheila pointing at him in front of other kids, loudly saying, "Don't let that creepy boy come near here. He walks like a little monster." My heart dropped. The other children laughed. My son looked down, confused and ashamed. That moment shattered something inside me. I didn't just see cruelty. I saw a bully hiding behind a garden fence, and I knew exactly what to do. No child deserves to be humiliated just for being different. If you've ever stood up for someone you love, or wish you had, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real-life stories that hit where it hurts and heals. My name is Hannah, and I never expected to become that mom, the one who had to fight tooth and nail for her child's dignity. I work as an office administrator at a local clinic. Nothing glamorous, but steady enough to keep a roof over our heads. My life revolves around two things: my job and my son, Mason. Mason is 8. He was born early, 31 weeks, and spent the first 2 months of his life in the NICU. We prayed every hour. And when he finally came home, we were told he'd been diagnosed with a mild form of cerebral palsy. The doctor said he might have some coordination issues, mostly with balance and walking, but his cognition and speech were perfectly normal. And they were right. Mason walks with a bit of a sway in his step. His left foot sometimes drags slightly when he's tired, and he can't run like the other kids. But he talks a mile a minute about sharks, space, and Legos. He loves riddles. He remembers every single birthday of every person in our family. And his laugh? It's the kind that makes strangers smile on bad days. After years of therapy, tears, and little victories, like tying his own shoes or learning to climb stairs without holding on, we finally felt like we had carved out a normal life. We moved into a quiet apartment complex in a middle-class suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina. It wasn't fancy, but it had a small park, a community pool, and kids in almost every building. I thought Mason would finally have a chance to make friends and just be a kid. For a while, things were hopeful. Mason was shy at first, but eventually, he started waving at the neighbor kids from our building. There was a group of them, 4 or 5 around his age, who would ride scooters and play tag after school. He'd inch closer every day, asking questions like, "Do you think they'd let me play if I wore my ankle brace?" Or, "What if I fall when I run? Will they laugh?" I reassured him, again and again, "Just be yourself, sweetie. If they're good kids, they'll see how awesome you are." He finally joined them one Friday afternoon. I watched from the window as he ran. Not fast, not smooth, but brave. He smiled when one of the girls handed him a piece of chalk to draw on the sidewalk. It was the first time I'd seen him with kids his age, relaxed, not self-conscious. But that tiny glimmer of hope was short-lived. Sheila moved in 3 months after us. Late 50s, recently divorced, always in a tight workout outfit, and constantly complaining about noise, about smells, about kids leaving their bikes in the breezeway. She introduced herself the day she caught Mason walking too close to her flower pots. "Watch where he's stepping. I just watered those. And maybe tell him not to drag his feet like that. It's not good for the tiles." I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just blunt. Not everyone's warm and fuzzy. But her behavior started to escalate. She would frown when Mason passed her porch. If the kids were playing too loudly, she'd come out with a broom and bang it on the railing. I tried to keep my distance, but it was clear she didn't like children, and she especially didn't like Mason. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was struggling with something I didn't know. I told myself to give her grace. Then came that afternoon. Mason had brought his coloring book outside and was sitting on the curb near the other kids, not even playing, just watching and smiling. I was upstairs on our balcony folding laundry when I heard Sheila's voice, sharp, loud, and unmistakable. "Hey, Y'all don't have to let that creepy boy hang around. I've seen the way he walks. It's not right. Kids like that should be supervised or kept inside. The words hit like a slap. I froze. One of the boys laughed, then mimicked Mason's limp. Another backed away, whispering something I couldn't hear. Mason stood up slowly, his coloring book falling from his lap. He looked around at the kids, then down at his feet. And then, like a knife to my chest, I watched him turn around and walk back toward our building with his head bowed. I met him at the door. He didn't say anything. He didn't cry. He just whispered, "I don't think they want me there." That night, he didn't eat dinner. He went to bed early and clutched his stuffed turtle like he was 5 again. I stood at the kitchen sink, shaking, replaying her words again and again. My hands clenched the dish towel until it tore. She didn't just insult my son. She told an entire group of children that he wasn't welcome, that he was creepy, that he didn't belong. She wanted to shame him into hiding. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just sad. I wasn't just angry. I was done. The next morning, Mason wouldn't get out of bed. He didn't fake sick. He just lay there, eyes open, quietly staring at the ceiling. I sat on the edge of the mattress, brushing my hand through his hair. "Sweetheart, it's Saturday," I said gently. "You can draw, or we can go to the library. Remember you wanted to check out that shark book?" He shook his head. "Maybe later," he mumbled. "I don't want to go outside today." My heart cracked a little deeper. I made him a smiley face pancake, which used to cheer him up instantly. He barely touched it. The boy who once giggled about syrup drowning his food now sat silently, pushing his fork around the plate. That afternoon, I went down to the mailbox and ran into Mrs. Davis, a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down. She leaned in and whispered, "I'm so sorry about what happened yesterday. That woman. I heard what she said." My stomach tightened. "Sheila has always been difficult," she continued. "But what she did to your son, that crossed a line." She wasn't the only one who noticed. Over the next 2 days, I received quiet looks of sympathy from a few other neighbors, some subtle, some bold. One father nodded toward the courtyard and said, "If you're thinking of filing a complaint, you won't be the only one." Still, something held me back. Fear? Maybe. Or the nagging voice that says, "Just let it go, you'll only make things worse." I've heard that voice all my life, especially as a single mom. Don't stir trouble, don't make waves, keep your head down and push through. But then came Monday. I had to leave work early to pick Mason up from school. His teacher, Mrs. Keating, called and said Mason had a meltdown during recess. Another student had teased the way he ran, and Mason had tried to hide behind the slide and refused to come out for almost 20 minutes. When I arrived, he was sitting on a bench outside the nurse's office, knees drawn to his chest. He didn't say anything until we got in the car. "Mom," he said quietly, "is there something wrong with me?" I pulled over immediately. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Absolutely not," I said, turning to him. "Mason, look at me. You are kind, smart, funny, and brave. There is nothing wrong with you." He blinked, his lower lip trembling. "Then why do people look at me like that? Like I'm weird or broken?" I couldn't answer right away. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive straight to that woman's door and make her feel an ounce of what she had made my child feel. But more than anything, I realized I was done staying silent. I couldn't protect Mason from every mean person in the world, but I could make sure the people who targeted him didn't get to do it without consequences. That night, after he was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down, word for word, what I'd heard Sheila say. I documented the exact time and date. I wrote out a timeline of previous incidents, including the time she told me to teach him to walk normal, and another when she scowled at him playing hopscotch alone. Then I opened my laptop and started digging. I found our apartment complex's management contact page and their community standards policy. One paragraph stood out. Any behavior deemed discriminatory, harassing, or verbally abusive toward tenants or their guests will be grounds for review and possible lease termination. Discriminatory, verbally abusive. I had both. But I wanted more than just a formal complaint. I wanted to shine a light on what had happened. I wanted people to understand the kind of harm that casual cruelty can cause, especially when directed at a child with a disability. So I reached out to a local organization called Able NC, a nonprofit dedicated to disability rights advocacy. I'd seen their booth at a community fair once. I sent them an email with the subject line, "My neighbor called my son creepy for how he walks. I need help." To my surprise, someone responded within hours. Her name was Camille. She introduced herself as a community outreach advocate and asked if we could speak on the phone. That conversation changed everything. Camille listened, didn't rush me, and told me that what Sheila had done could be considered a form of ableist harassment. She also said I had the right to file both an internal housing complaint and an external civil rights grievance, especially if Mason's ability to access common areas was being impeded by discrimination. "She's not just being mean," Camille said. "She's creating a hostile environment for a child with a disability. That's illegal under both federal and state housing law." It wasn't just hurtful, it was actionable. Camille offered to help me write a formal complaint backed with policy citations. She also asked if I would be willing to speak with their legal partner if things escalated. I said yes. For the first time in days, I felt something I hadn't felt since the incident. Hope. Meanwhile, I got a tip from another mom in the complex. She said Sheila had clashed with at least 2 other families in the past, one over a barking dog, another over a child with autism. One of them had filed a noise complaint months ago, but nothing ever came of it. Now, I had more than one voice. I reached out to those families and asked if they'd be willing to submit statements. Both agreed. One even had a voicemail saved from Sheila yelling about weird kids who don't belong here. Piece by piece, I was building a case. But this wasn't just about eviction. This was about drawing a line. For my son, for every child who walks a little differently, and for every parent who's ever been told to just let it go. I wasn't letting it go. Not this time. I'd never filed a formal complaint in my life. Not at work, not at school, not even when my landlord forgot to fix our stove for 3 weeks. But this time was different. This wasn't about inconvenience. This was about principle. It was about my son walking with his head high again. The next morning, I met Camille from Able NC at a local coffee shop. She brought a folder of documents, all neatly organized, along with a quiet, steady confidence that I desperately needed. We reviewed every detail of my written account, word by word. Then she handed me a form to submit directly to property management, and another, this one more formal, to file with the North Carolina Human Relations Commission for disability-related housing discrimination. "I want you to understand," Camille said gently. "You're not overreacting. Your son has the right to feel safe in his home environment. This isn't petty. This is civil rights." Her words stayed with me long after I got home. That afternoon, I printed 3 copies of the formal complaint, signed them, and delivered them in person to the leasing office. I didn't come in angry. I came in prepared, calm, measured. "I'm here to file a harassment complaint against a fellow resident," I told the property manager, a young woman named Jasmine, who looked startled but professional. I handed her the envelope and explained briefly what had happened. Her eyes widened slightly when I said the word creepy and child with cerebral palsy in the same sentence. She promised me they'd escalate it to their legal department. Before I left, I added one more thing. There are other residents who've had problems with Sheila. I've spoken to 2. They're willing to give statements. That got her attention. By that evening, I'd emailed Jasmine digital copies of the neighbor statements, including the voicemail where Sheila ranted about strange kids lowering the tone of the place, I also included the time-stamped audio I'd captured from my balcony, where Sheila called my son creepy. It wasn't crystal clear, but you could hear it. The next move was harder, but maybe the most powerful. With Camille's help, I wrote a personal letter, not to the management, but to the entire community. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was honest. I posted it on our neighborhood bulletin board and shared it in the private Facebook group for our apartment complex. I started it with, "My name is Hannah. I live in Unit 3B with my 8-year-old son Mason, who has mild cerebral palsy. He walks differently than most kids, but he walks with more courage than anyone I've ever met." I described what Sheila had said. I shared how Mason had stopped going outside, how he had asked if something was wrong with him. I ended with, "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for empathy, for your voices to join mine in saying this is not okay. Discrimination against children with disabilities is not just hurtful, it's unlawful, and it has no place in our community." I didn't expect much, but by the next morning the post had over 60 comments. Nearly all of them were supportive. Some neighbors wrote, "We've seen Mason. He's always sweet and respectful. Sheila owes you both an apology." Others admitted they'd had similar experiences with her. A few even offered to speak to management directly. And then came the quiet knock. I opened the door to find Mrs. Ramirez, the older woman from across the courtyard, holding a tray of cookies. She didn't say much, just handed me the tray, squeezed my hand and said, "Your boy is strong. So are you." In just a few days, what had once felt like an isolated, humiliating moment had become something bigger, something that brought people together. Still, Sheila hadn't backed down. Not yet. But I could feel the tide shifting. The silence was breaking. The management team scheduled an official meeting with Sheila the following week, and while I wasn't invited, I knew what they had in their hands: audio, witness statements, and a groundswell of support from tenants. I wasn't just a mom anymore. I was a witness, an advocate, a force she hadn't counted on, and I had only just begun. By the end of that week, our quiet little apartment complex was buzzing in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was open conversations in the laundry room, subtle glances when Sheila walked past, and more neighbors stepping forward with their own uncomfortable stories. Apparently, Mason and I weren't the only ones she'd targeted. A young couple said she'd accused them of bringing crime into the building just because they played music on their balcony. Another woman admitted Sheila once told her to train that screeching brat when her autistic son had a meltdown in the hallway. The property manager, Jasmine, reached out again. "Sheila has been issued a formal warning," she said. "But given the number of complaints and the evidence you and others have provided, we're opening a full review of her lease." Full review. Those words felt like a crack in the dam. But Sheila didn't go quietly. Within 2 days of receiving that warning, she posted a note on the bulletin board, written in red ink, underlined 3 times. "This complex is going downhill fast. Some people don't belong here and never did. If you care about decency, speak up before it's too late." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who wrote it. The backlash was immediate. Someone scribbled over the note, "We choose kindness." Another neighbor posted a printed copy of the Fair Housing Act with sections about disability discrimination highlighted in yellow. Still, Sheila kept pushing. She stopped one of the teen boys in the courtyard and said, loud enough for others to hear, "Be careful who you let your siblings play with. Some kids have issues." When I heard about that from his mom, my jaw clenched so hard I thought I might break a tooth. This wasn't just about Mason anymore. This was Sheila trying to poison every connection, every ounce of community we'd built. But for every insult she flung, there was a counterweight now. A neighbor brought Mason a drawing set, saying her daughter wanted to color with him. A man from the 3rd floor told me he used to be teased for his stutter and thanked me for speaking up. One elderly resident, who barely spoke English, slipped a note under our door with just 4 words: "You strong, we proud." And then, something I hadn't expected happened. Camille contacted me again. She'd shared our situation, anonymously, with a local journalist who was writing a piece on ableism in housing communities. The journalist wanted to speak to me, carefully, respectfully, no names, no photos, just the story. I hesitated at first. I didn't want Mason exposed to more attention. But after thinking it over, I realized this was exactly the kind of light Sheila had hoped to avoid. So I agreed. The article ran a week later. The headline read, "When Home Isn't Safe, a Mother's Fight Against Subtle Cruelty." It described our story in broad strokes, how a boy with a disability had been mocked by a neighbor, and how a community came together to demand accountability. It quoted Camille about the rights of tenants under disability law, and it mentioned that the apartment complex was currently reviewing a tenant's lease due to multiple complaints of discriminatory conduct. No names, no slander, just facts. But that didn't stop the firestorm. By the next morning, the apartment complex's Facebook group was flooded with comments, screenshots of the article, and people praising whoever had come forward. One post simply read, "Whoever you are, thank you. You made this place better." Management was now under public pressure, and they knew it. The next notice we got wasn't subtle. All residents were invited to attend a community standards review meeting, something that hadn't happened in over 2 years. The topic? Creating a safe, inclusive environment for all residents. Sheila didn't attend, but I did. So did over 30 neighbors. Jasmine stood at the front and laid it all out. The complex would be revising its policies around resident conduct, expanding its reporting process, and yes, reviewing the leases of tenants who had repeatedly violated those standards. That night, for the first time in months, Mason and I sat on the balcony as the sun set. He looked over at the courtyard and said, "Mom, can I ride my scooter again tomorrow?" I smiled. "Yeah, baby, you can ride wherever you want." Because the world might still have Sheilas. But now, Mason knew he wasn't alone. And Sheila? Her silence was finally starting to sound like fear. When people unite against cruelty, especially when it's aimed at a child, the outcome is powerful. If you've ever stood your ground for someone who couldn't, let us know in the comments. Like this video, and subscribe for more stories where justice finds its way home. The tide had shifted. What started as subtle resistance had turned into a quiet but unmistakable revolt. Emily could feel it in the air every time she walked through the office. The artificial smiles were gone. Whispers traveled faster than emails. People who once blindly echoed Linda's words were now pausing, watching, thinking. The morning after the memo leak, Linda stormed into the executive floor. She slammed her office door so hard the blinds shook. Emily didn't flinch. She was already seated at her desk, calmly typing away, sipping coffee. There was no fear left in her. Only focus. Then came the unexpected. HR scheduled a mandatory meeting for all department heads to discuss internal ethical conduct. That had never happened before, not in all the 10 years Emily had worked there. She smiled inwardly. The dominoes were beginning to fall. Behind the scenes, Emily and 3 trusted colleagues were collecting written testimonies. Some were anonymous. Others, like the junior analyst who Linda once screamed at until he cried, were ready to speak on record. Each statement was a crack in Linda's porcelain-perfect image. Meanwhile, the whispers had reached corporate headquarters in New York. Emily had arranged a private call with the regional VP, Daniel Vega, a man she'd met at a retreat years ago and quietly stayed in touch with. Daniel was not a fan of Linda. He'd always seen through her performative charm. Emily sent him a confidential packet with timelines, quotes, and audio clips from the gala. His only response, "You've been patient. Let me know when it's time." It was almost time, but Emily knew better than to strike without perfect timing. She needed one last piece, a witness inside Linda's inner circle, someone who had seen her manipulations up close. That's when Donna, Linda's executive assistant, asked to meet for lunch. Donna had always been loyal to Linda, but the events at the gala, and the wave of fallout after, had shaken her. Over sandwiches in a quiet cafe, Donna confessed, "She made me cover up so many things, not just about Aiden. She's been falsifying budget reports, padding travel expenses, even claimed donations that never happened." Emily stared, jaw tight. "Would you be willing to say that in writing?" Donna hesitated. "Only if I can submit it through legal. I'm not going down with her." Emily nodded. "You won't. I promise." That night, Emily stayed late at the office, assembling a final dossier. Not just of Linda's cruelty, but her corruption, the fake charities, the expense fraud, the private WhatsApp group where she mocked employees behind their backs, screenshotted and saved. She printed 2 copies. One went to the VP, the other to the legal department, sealed and anonymous. It was the calm before the storm. And just as she finished taping the envelope shut, her phone buzzed. It was Linda. The message read, "Emergency meeting, tomorrow, 9 a.m., boardroom, be ready." Emily stared at the screen. Her hands didn't shake, her heart didn't race. She simply smiled. Because she was ready. It was the night of the annual corporate holiday gala, a glitzy, over-the-top affair hosted at an upscale downtown venue. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, white silk drapes, and tables laced with gold accents. Waiters in tuxedos carried trays of champagne, and a string quartet played carols in the background. On the surface, it was a picture of success and opulence. But under that elegant shell, Emily had laid the final trap. She stood near the stage, dressed in a sleek black gown that made her look powerful, regal. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Linda, laughing near the VIP table, oblivious to the storm headed her way. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the MC tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner, our CFO, Emily, has a short year-end reflection prepared." Applause. Linda smiled tightly, clearly annoyed not to be the center of attention. Emily walked to the stage, steady as a heartbeat. She began with the usual, numbers, growth, company highlights. Then her tone shifted. "There's something I feel compelled to share, not as a CFO, but as a mother." The room grew still. "Some of you may not know, but my son, Aiden, lives with autism. He's brilliant, sensitive, and incredibly brave. He once told me, 'Mom, some people wear masks so long they forget what their real face looks like.' I didn't understand what he meant until this year." Linda shifted in her seat, her smile fading. Emily clicked a remote. Behind her, the massive screen flickered on. The first image appeared, a blurry snapshot from the company holiday party last year. Aiden, alone, crying in a corner. Then came the video. Gasps filled the room. Linda, tipsy and loud, could be heard mocking Aiden's breakdown. "What's wrong with him? Someone wind him up again?" Followed by the laughter of a few colleagues. One voice was clearly hers, cruel, unmistakable. Emily let it play for a moment, then paused it. That video never should have existed. But it does, because cruelty thrives when we're silent. The crowd was frozen. Some executives looked down. Others looked horrified. Linda stood abruptly. "This is outrageous! This is a personal attack." Emily didn't flinch. "You've built your career on charm and strategy, Linda. But behind the boardroom doors, you mocked vulnerability. You ridiculed someone who couldn't defend himself. Tonight, we're done hiding it." More images appeared. Screenshots of emails Linda had sent, calling employees with mental health needs liabilities. A few women in the audience gasped. One quietly wiped away a tear. Then came testimonies, pre-recorded, anonymized. Employees detailing how Linda bullied them, humiliated them in front of peers, cut them off for being too soft. Each account delivered like a punch. Linda tried to leave, but the exit was now lined with journalists. Emily had tipped them off discreetly. One of them approached her with a mic. "Ms. Harrow, do you have a comment about the video and internal culture accusations?" She froze. Cameras flashed. Emily stepped down from the stage, walking calmly past Linda. "You taught me one thing," she said quietly as she passed. "Power is just a mask, until someone dares to rip it off." The room erupted, not with applause, but murmurs of truth finally spoken aloud. HR heads approached Emily, asking to speak. Board members looked rattled. Linda stood cornered, mascara smudged, fury in her eyes. But Emily didn't stop to gloat. She returned to her table, sat beside a glowing Aiden, who was watching the live feed from home, safe and proud. She texted him one word: "Done." For the first time in what felt like years, the house felt still, peaceful, not tense. Lauren sat at the dining room table, the very one that once hosted so many awkward, painful dinners under Nora's scrutiny. The silence now wasn't hollow, it was restorative. She could finally breathe. The fallout after the confrontation had spread fast and loud, just as Lauren expected. Nora's meltdown in front of the family had become a whisper trail through every cousin, aunt, and family friend. But what shocked most wasn't her behavior, it was the documents Lauren handed out. Hard evidence, the double mortgages, the account transfers, the manipulation. At first, a few relatives tried to downplay it, arguing Nora must have had good intentions. But by the third day, Lauren had received over a dozen calls, from people apologizing, offering support, or simply stunned at the scale of what Nora had done. Nora, in her usual fashion, attempted to retake control. She tried guilt. She sent a long message about family unity, trying to spin the betrayal as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. But it didn't land. Not this time. Lauren didn't respond. Instead, she began setting clear boundaries, painful, necessary lines drawn in the sand. She called a family meeting, but not at her house. She rented a small conference room at a local library, neutral ground. Everyone was invited, even Nora. When people arrived, they found printed folders waiting for them, a simple outline of what had happened, what changes were being made, and a very clear message from Lauren. "From this point forward, any financial discussions must go through our attorney. There will be no more unspoken agreements or backroom favors. I will not be the family fixer anymore." Nora didn't show, but it didn't matter. The room was filled with quiet nods and murmured acknowledgments. Some looked ashamed, others relieved. For the first time, Lauren felt they were truly seeing her, not as the dependable daughter, not the peacekeeper, but a woman who had been used and finally chose to stop it. That night, she changed the locks. She donated half the things Nora had insisted were too sentimental to throw away, but that really just cluttered her home and reminded her of compromise. She repainted the hallway, removed the family portraits. She kept a few things, photos of her dad, her own childhood drawings, but everything else went. Each act felt like shedding a layer of guilt that didn't belong to her. In the weeks that followed, she met with a therapist, not just for her, but for Max too. They'd both been under Nora's thumb for so long that freedom felt foreign, even frightening. Max opened up faster than she expected. He said, "Grandma made me feel small." That simple sentence broke her heart, but also gave her hope, because now they could name it. And once you name a wound, you can begin to heal it. Lauren also returned to the art studio she had abandoned 5 years earlier. Her first painting was jagged, raw, full of dark reds and slate blues. It was chaos on canvas, but it was real. She didn't need to explain it to anyone. For the first time in her adult life, Lauren was living not for peace, but for truth. Not for acceptance, but for self-respect. And with Nora out of the picture, truth was finally allowed to bloom. In the weeks that followed, Emily found herself waking up with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Her mornings were quiet, her coffee warm, and her son's laughter, unburdened and loud, filled the house. For the first time since Aiden's diagnosis, she felt like they were no longer surviving. They were living. She spent long afternoons walking in the nearby park with Aiden. No phones, no emails, just conversation, sometimes deep, sometimes silly. Aiden had started drawing again, filling sketchbooks with comic-style revenge heroes who looked suspiciously like his mom. Emily never asked, but each time she saw a new page, her heart clenched in a sweet, painful way. Back at work, a new interim CEO was brought in, one who actually listened, who held real staff meetings, who asked about employee well-being. For the first few days, Emily stayed quiet, wary, but slowly, she offered suggestions. She saw them implemented. The culture shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was human. For the first time, her skills were acknowledged not as favors to someone in power, but as assets of her own. The media storm surrounding Linda didn't die down easily. After the SEC investigation and IRS audit unearthed years of misconduct, Linda was slapped with hefty fines and was banned from operating as an executive for the next decade. She vanished from headlines, her name now synonymous with fraud, not fashion. Emily never celebrated publicly. She didn't post on social media, didn't gloat in the break room. But in the quiet corners of her life, in the smiles of coworkers no longer afraid to speak up, in the thank you notes left anonymously on her desk, and in the peaceful hum of her own home, she felt the victory every day. One night, as she tucked Aiden into bed, he looked up at her with those same curious green eyes and asked, "Do you think you were a hero, Mom?" She paused, unsure how to answer. "I don't know, sweetheart," she finally said. "Maybe I was just someone who couldn't let the bad guys win." Aiden smiled, pulling his blanket up to his chin. "That's what a hero would say." She turned off the light and stood in the doorway, watching him drift to sleep. And for the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to believe that what had been broken could be healed, not just punished. Her revenge hadn't been about cruelty, it had been about justice, about giving her son a world where people were held accountable for what they did, where laughter could return after pain. And in that soft, sacred quiet, she smiled, not out of satisfaction, but peace.